You're listening to Choose FI Radio. The blueprint for financial independence lives here. If you're looking to unlock the secrets to financial independence and early retirement, you're in the right place. Stay tuned and join a community of like-minded people who are getting off the hamster wheel and taking control of their lives in the pursuit of financial independence. Choose FI, your home for financial independence online.
All right, everyone. Today, we're going to be speaking with Laura from richandresilientliving.com. And I think our community sends us messages all the time saying, you know, I understand the idea of building financial capital, building wealth for myself, but like, what does it look like when you're thinking about your life more holistically? What does it look like when you're thinking about building your community, when you're very invested in sustainability and environmentalism, when you're trying to look at the next chapter of your life through the lens of what does it look like for me to optimize not just my net worth, but all these other aspects of my life? That's a conversation that I think a lot of us grapple with. And I think the conversation is one you should be constantly looking to explore and expand your horizons and get new perspectives on, and you'll benefit from it. So today, with that ethos in mind, we're going to tackle the different types of capital and how you can start building a holistic approach to this today. And we're going to do that with Laura Oldanie from richandresilientliving.com. To help me with this, I have my co-host Brad here with me today. How you doing, buddy?
Hey, Jonathan, I am doing quite well. And yeah, that word holistic, I think that is the critical word here, because in looking at Laura's website and seeing the 8 forms of capital, I don't know if you would ask me if I could have named really, frankly, any of them other than financial capital. But when I'm looking at it and I'm seeing social capital, we talk about that. Intellectual capital, we talk about that. Experiential capital, right? These are all things that when you actually see them, when you think about it holistically, you realize there is vastly more than just merely financial capital. So I'm curious to really get a full sense of this from Laura. So Laura, with that, welcome to Choose FI.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me on for this broader conversation about wealth.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. So is that it? There's 3 types of capital we can go and break now?
No, there are more forms of capital. And I learned about these forms of capital through my involvement with permaculture, which some of your listeners may know, but some may not. And I like to describe permaculture as a design science that looks to nature as the example. It's closed loop, no waste systems. So we're trying to design to meet human needs, but also improve the ecosystems within which humans live at the same time. And so it was through discovering permaculture and going through my permaculture design course that I was introduced to this concept of multiple forms of capital. And it's not an idea that is specific or original to permaculture. It's just that there are 2 well-known people in the permaculture space that pulled together these concepts and constructed a well-known article called The 8 Forms of Capital, in which they outlined them in very great detail. But these forms of capital have also been talked about in slightly different terms in the community capital framework that was pulled together by some academics and other communities themselves. It's a great way for community asset mapping to take place by looking at these other forms of capital. So I did get introduced to them through permaculture, and that is the lens through which I talk about them. But I just want to be clear that they're not original to permaculture.
So permaculture, I've got to be honest, this is the first time I'm hearing about this. So I'd love to slow down a little bit on that and actually talk about financial permaculture, because I know you mentioned that repeatedly on your website. Can you just give us a better sense? Obviously, you've given the definition, right? The closed loop, no waste system, but give us just a little more about permaculture and how you got into it. And then I guess about financial permaculture specifically.
Certainly. Well, permaculture, like me, many people come to permaculture first through our gardens and our interest in sustainability. We hear the concept of a food forest, and we want to learn more about how to grow our own food and make our homes and properties and our lives more resilient out in the natural world primarily. But there is actually a permaculture flower with 7 petals, and one of them is that land and nature stewardship petal. But there are other petals like the built environment, our inner landscape, and one of the petals is finances and economics. So there are 12 guiding principles to permaculture, and they can all be applied to each of those petals. So catch and store energy is one of the principles, and that can be applied in the landscape or in the home, but it can also be applied, and we talk a lot about that here on Choose Fi and many financial independence spaces when we talk about saving our money, catching and storing energy. The energy is the financial capital when we talk about it in the financial independence space most often. So then when I started learning that there was more to permaculture than just the landscape, I was very intrigued because I was introduced to permaculture probably just about the time I turned 40 years old. And I already had been working for nonprofits for a number of years, and I had retirement accounts. I had employer-based retirement accounts, and I wasn't that pleased with the investing options that were available to me. So I started looking to permaculture to see what conversations were occurring in the permaculture space around money and investing and finances. And that's when I was introduced to financial permaculture and this whole initiative that really got off the ground around 2010, 2013. I think there were a number of people in the permaculture space that came together to kind of outline what that looks like. And you touched on a good bit of it already, Brad, when you posed the question, but it's definitely this no waste, closed loop system of largely localized economies. But not only, but definitely just, again, applying those permaculture principles to our finances. And much of the thinking that was done early on in the permaculture space was at the macro level around this, creating larger permaculture economies. And what I'm trying to do is bring it down more to the personal finance space that we talk about so much in the financial independence community.
And Laura, I wanted to ask again about permaculture, just to finish this conversation before we move on. So you talked before about catching and storing energy, which is clearly saving money in this sense. Are there other principles of permaculture that would apply to people pursuing financial independence? Like I'm thinking no waste. Like how does this tie in to people pursuing FI?
Very much so. I think all 12 of them could be applied to financial independence. And in fact, I do have a couple of blog posts where I've linked some of them. And I know that the man behind the Simple Dollar has written a blog post where he's, again, linked financial principles to each of the financial or to the permaculture principles. But yes, certainly produce no waste. Obtain a yield is one of the principles. So we want to earn money, and we don't want to spend more than we earn. Observe and interact. So, budgeting and tracking our spending. Again, all of these 12 principles, they apply to all aspects of our lives.
Now, Laura, I just want to point out, I heard you mention socially responsible investing there. And I know by going through your website and a little of what you just said, you do this at the local level. That's important. We actually get a lot of messages from people asking what socially responsible investing would look like. They don't want to be a part of particular companies that they feel are part of an index. And they're saying, I want to do this. And for me, as a guy that craves simplicity, if that's the way that you feel and you feel strongly about that, I would start looking for strategies to create some form of my own index that maybe doesn't have those. And it's an imperfect method, but up to this point, it's probably the best that you could hope for. I want to point out to our audience, like that is not actually what you personally are describing. And I just want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about when you say socially responsible investing at the local level, what does that mean for you?
So it means looking for investments that are available in my local community, but those investing opportunities are still few and far between. So I'm also looking for investing opportunities that are meaningful outside of the stock market in other communities or available to a wider audience. And I can name a few examples. For example, American Homeowner Preservation is a fund that's buying distressed mortgages and working to keep people in their homes. and they're doing this all across the country. Now, to me, it feels like a much more socially responsible investment than what I can access through the stock market. So it's not part of a fund. I have a self-directed IRA. So I'm doing all of this through that type of retirement account, which allows for a greater variety of investing. So I've purchased a share of a local permaculture farm, which is a local investment. I lent money to a friend who was helping rescue the oldest organic farm in Tampa Bay, and that money was returned with interest. So if I'm not able to find those, it's looking to some of the innovative things that are happening across the country that are also accessible to non-accredited investors.
Laura, when you think about socially responsible investing, what's the intersection of doing good, if you will, versus returns? Like, I'd love to hear how you think about it, because I think when a lot of people hear this, they kind of scoff and say, oh, it's just essentially charity. Maybe I'll get my money back. It's not actual investing. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you personally approach it. Is it, hey, if I do get a little bit of interest, it's great, like I'm doing this mostly for the good? Or is it more akin to like a traditional investment, if you will, where you're trying to, if not maximize return, then at least get X% return or some such?
Well, I am doing this investing through my retirement account. So I don't want it to be, I'm not viewing it as a charitable contribution. I certainly recognize that I'm taking risks with my money that other people aren't. But more and more people are thinking this way, and more opportunities are coming online. But for me, there's this risk that we talk about in personal finance. Doing what I'm doing is a risky investment. But for me, there are far greater risks as well when we look at the environment and the degradation that many of our investments are causing to the environment. And when we look at, what's causing the coronavirus and COVID-19 and, food shortages and all these types of things, there are risks that are bigger than what we tend to look at with those other investments that we're making, or the risks of harming other people and depleting our human capital through our investments and putting people into poverty and such horrible situations where we end up suffering as well when people around us are in poverty. So there are other risks I look at.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is really what is at the heart of FI, which is short term versus long term, right?
Very much so.
Yeah, that is certainly food for thought, if nothing else. And thank you so much for explaining that. That's really, really helpful. Our team here at ChooseFI has been using Stamps.com to send out the Simple Startup Workbook, actually, to members of the camp that signed up. So instead of having to go out to the post office every time just to mail one or two of these books, they literally can print the shipping labels from home and just put it in their own mailbox. So, I mean, this saves probably a half hour back and forth to the post office every single time they go to send them out. So just personally, we've had an amazing amount of time savings and money savings as well from Stamps.com. And like I said, with Stamps.com, you get great discounts as well. 5 cents off every stamp and up to 62% off USPS and UPS shipping rates. Stamps.com is a no-brainer, saving you time and money. Right now, our listeners get a special offer that includes a 4-week trial plus free postage and a digital scale without any long-term commitment. Just go to Stamps.com, click on the microphone at the top of the homepage, and type in Choose FI. That's Stamps.com and enter Choose FI. Choose FI community, we actually need your help. Every week, we ask you guys to leave reviews for this podcast. And the follow through has been mind blowing. We've received over 3,000 5-star reviews, and it's just incredible. Honestly, I read every single one of these. Everyone on our team does as well. So thank you. And I have another ask for you. If you've purchased one of our books, if you've read one of our books through the library, we need you to leave a review. This makes an enormous difference. We are really, really trying to grow Choose FI Publishing. And this will be a game changer for us. So if you've already purchased one of the books, we'd love it if you could leave a review at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Goodreads, or wherever you purchase it from. And if you haven't bought one of our books and want to check out the lineup, head to choosefi.com/publishing. And you can see all of the titles available. We would really love it if you could purchase one and leave a review. It would really mean the world to us. So thank you as always.
I do want to highlight the inherent risk, though, in what you're describing. As much as you do want to create a difference, like there are much bigger platforms that offer much more diversity that I'm wary of investing in because my money could walk away. And so, I just for our audience, do your diligence. There's a lot of investments that the easiest way to get $1 million is to start with $2 million. There's plenty of those types of things. And so I'm not marginalizing this, but I want people to understand the gravity of the seriousness. And when you're investing in a non-diversified portfolio, you need to make sure you understand the risk. You need to understand what the ROI could be and what's the worst that can happen and be very, very confident in that. And I think the best case scenario is hopefully to find a blend that you're comfortable with, the risk tolerance that you're comfortable with. But I have significant concerns about my own ability to go source on a consistent basis enough of, these to be able to make sure that for myself and my family over a period of like 10 or 20 or 30 years, if financial capital is the only thing that we're talking about, that I would be able to generate enough by finding enough of these types of deals, because it would only take one or two probably to really tank your results. Now, having said that, I know this is not the only type of capital that you rely on, and some of the other forms of capital that you invest in, to some degree, soften your risk tolerance. So I'd like to give us an opportunity to kind of transition and talk about some of the other forms of capital.
So I'm really glad you brought that up, Jonathan. And for me, it goes back to these multiple forms of capital. That's part of how I'm mitigating my risk. And I do want to underscore again what you said. This is risky. It's unexplored. It's unfolding as I'm doing it. I will also put out there that I'm single and I don't have any children, which probably, and I'm a former Peace Corps volunteer, an adventurer. I think it makes me more prone to yet another non-traditional step in my life. But again, back to these multiple forms of capital, they're a big part of what is out there as my safety net, in a sense of protection. And they're a safety net and a sense of protection that I think are available to all who can start looking more closely at them. So it sounds like it would be helpful at this point to run through and give examples of each of these forms of capital.
Please.
Okay. So yes, the first one is financial capital, and that's the one we all know in this realm, and I don't have to describe. Another form of capital is material capital. So that's your home. That's the microphones we're using to record this. That's the jewelry making tools that someone's using to create jewelry. It's the shovel that someone in the permaculture space is outside digging a hole with in their garden. These are material forms of capital, the shoes that we're wearing. So those are very tangible forms of capital that, tractors, other things that I think we can somewhat easily see value in. Intellectual capital, Jonathan mentioned earlier. So the knowledge we have from school that we can gain from books, our creativity, our ability to innovate and think outside of the box is intellectual capital. So experiential capital, that's when you were learning how to be a podcaster and all of that's involved in podcasting, knowing how to be a plumber or change your bike tire. Or if I read in a book about bartending how to make a Bloody Mary, so that's expanding my intellectual capital when I'm reading about that. But then I actually go and make the Bloody Mary, then I'm tapping experiential capital. Then we have the social capital that we've alluded to, and that is our friends, our family, our mentors. If we're in school, it's all of the people in school with us, our church families, the Choose FI community online and all the in-person meetups. You guys talk so much about building community. It can be the mutual aid networks that are springing up and gaining popularity in the midst of the pandemic, or the time banks that exist in certain places like the one I'm involved in here. But it's getting a job through a contact or someone it's using our social networks.
You mentioned two terms that I know our audience is like, and I wanted to go back to them. You said mutual aid and time banks. Can we explain a little bit more about what those are before we talk about the next capital?
So mutual aid is just what it sounds like. It's mutual and it's aid, so it's helping people. And it's not that well known, but it existed before COVID-19. There were mutual aid circles. This was very, I think, commonplace during the Great Depression when financial capital wasn't as accessible and people needed to get together and help each other. It looks a lot like what we think of with the Amish barn raising. But now I think it's getting more formalized. And if people are interested, they can Google search and find more to read on mutual aid networks online. There may be a mutual aid network in their community, and it's just people coming together to help people. So that's the mutual aid network. A time bank is a concept that was created, I believe, in the 80s by Edgar Kahn. And it's this idea that people's time is the currency and everyone's time is equally valued. He developed this, I think, after he had maybe an operation of some sort and wasn't feeling as healthy. He's a lawyer, but he still wanted to find ways to add value and have that value recognized. So he developed this concept of time banking. And there are websites, I think it's the US Time Bank, or if you Google search time bank, you'll find it. But these days, they're generally administered through a software. And the beauty of it is that it builds community because it's all different individuals come together. It's a localized thing. And I guess you could also look at it as kind of like people on this podcast have heard about buy nothing groups before, but it's buy nothing kind of with a centralized software system where each of those exchanges earns you a time credit of some sort. So you're not always exchanging directly with the same person. And you can post things like very creative things, like someone here in my community wants to build soil and they compost. So they accept people's food scraps, and so someone is giving them time credits to accept their food scraps. It can be also, helping someone weed in their garden, or I have so many mangoes on my tree and I can't clean them all up, or I'm too old to harvest them myself. And so it's just a great way. When I started my first blog, there's someone in our community, a friend of mine who's in the Time Bank who knows WordPress. So she helped create my website for time credit.
Wow.
That's wild. So it's a currency, or do you give that time bank in that particular case, this person who helped you with WordPress, do you help that person specifically back with X number of hours of your own time, or is it just amongst the entire community?
It's amongst the entire community, that time credit. I do give her a time credit for her service, but it's logged in the system and she doesn't have to get the service back from me. She can then take that time credit to someone else, and it can be an exchange of a good or a service.
That's beautiful. I love that.
That's really cool.
So how is the time credits generated? Do you start with a batch of 40 credits and you get a renewal once a month? Or give me a sense for what the actual behind the scenes mechanism is.
Sure. Yes, we come at this from a very standardized financial independence mentality, but generally, and I know our time bank best, we're allowed to even operate in a deficit. We just want to generate the community and the exchanges, but you do get time bank credits even just for creating your account. You get a credit. You have to be activated and go to an initiation meeting online. You get a time bank credit for that. We have time bank potlucks, which we're doing online now. You get a time credit for attending the potluck. So they're very easy to come by, and it's just you want to generate the interaction. We've been calling our senior members of the time bank in the pandemic to check on them, and you get time bank credits for volunteering to do that.
Love that.
Jonathan, I think we'll both be Googling Time Bank Richmond, VA after this. That's really cool.
Very cool. All right. Well, I stopped you in the middle. I feel like that. I'm glad I did for us and for our audience, but I did interrupt you. You were about to tell us about living capital.
Sure. So living capital is the gardening, probably is the easiest example for people in this listening to this podcast to recognize. So it's the food we grow in our gardens. It's our flowers, the trees, the shade they provide, the air we breathe, water, all of that living natural capital, our natural resources. Then we have cultural capital. So that is something we create together in groups. It's the shared history, the shared music, the movies, the books we're reading, that's cultural capital, the food, the spices that we associate with different cultures. And then lastly, we have spiritual capital. And it doesn't have to be a religious faith. It can be your yoga practice, your meditation practice, whatever is bringing you peace of mind can be considered your spiritual capital. And so those are the 8 primary forms of capital that we talk about in the permaculture space. If I can, I would also add a couple other forms of capital that get talked about here and there. And one of them you all talk about very frequently without necessarily categorizing it as a form of capital. And we all know this very well from Vicki Robin and Joe Dominguez, time. Time is the one form of capital that's not renewable. It's the one we're losing. Everything else we can tap, we can get more of, but we can't get more time. Another one is health. Health is a form of capital. Without our health, it's much harder to access or enjoy the other forms of capital. And then lastly, one I've been made aware of is attention as a form of capital. You think about social media and and just all of the information and things that are accessible to us online these days that draw our attention. It's the trade-off we're making every time we pay attention to something and we're not paying attention to something else. Are we paying attention to negative things that are filling us with fear and, making us scared? Or are we filling us with things that lift us up and make us see opportunities? And are we stopping to step away from all of that's available to us to be creative and productive ourselves?
Yeah, Laura, this is really, really interesting. And I feel like, again, I haven't ever thought of these overtly, right? Like financial capital is obvious, but once you think about these, it's clear that these very obviously are forms of capital, and putting language to something is so critical in life. And what I'm curious about now is, in your exploration of this, what's different for you after having come across these, right? And after focusing on them, like, it's enough in and of itself to understand that there are these 8 plus those 3, right? We're at least 11 forms of capital. Like, that's valuable in and of itself. But what's actually changed for you since you've focused on them?
Well, one is what we've talked about a little bit already, is my faith in taking the leap to pursue my version of socially responsible investing. But I'd also say that it's really shaping how I'm coming to think about retirement planning. And this goes to a little bit more of, let me back up and just present this idea that these forms of capital, if we look at them, they're the things we really want in life. The financial capital is simply the means to access these other forms of capital. And in fact, financial capital came about by tapping these other forms of capital initially. That first exchange was probably an extraction of natural resources of some sort. But it was whatever it was recognizing the value of these other forms of capital. And so the quality of life comes in the other forms of capital. It's not that we want green pieces of paper and little pieces of metal per se. They're just the means of exchange we as a society have agreed upon. And when I think about retirement planning, it's certainly, I recognize the value of financial capital. I recognize the reality of the society I am a part of. And I know I need financial capital if I need a new roof, or something done. Although probably if you worked really hard on it, you could find a way to get a new roof for free.
If you've got enough time banked, you certainly could.
Yes, yes. But there is value in financial capital. But I think especially now, I had thought this way before, but what we see unfolding with COVID-19, I really don't want to end up in an elder care facility. I want to age with grace and with dignity, with around people that care about me in my home. And so I'm thinking about, how do I retrofit my house so that a caretaker or a caregiver can live with me if I need that? I'm thinking about creating the food forest that I need. I just bought my house 9 months ago. So I've planted 6 Florida-friendly olive trees that like to struggle. They're low maintenance. They're going to produce a food that has value that not many people around me are growing, but they do well here in Florida. I can barter with them. I can exchange them in the time bank. If I need to sell them to draw more financial capital, I can. I'm thinking very much about building up that social capital as I build my community to age in place here and have the networks that I need to. And I don't want it to sound like I'm only thinking about how to tap people so I can have some advantage from them. I want rich human relationships in my life as well.
You said so much there, and I want to tie it back to how recognizing that there are these different types of capital, and I think you've listed at least 11 of them. I heard 11. It might be 12, but 11 of them is what I wrote down. And how you identify them, how you started building them. And then I want to tie that back to how that has lowered your risk tolerance. So as you said, financial capital is not the ends. Having the net worth is not the ends. It's a means to an end. The end is to have all these different types of capital. And you have a couple points of fear that I think are represented by a lot of people in our audience. I know my mom has told me this fear explicitly. She does not want to end up in an elder care home. Like that for her is just like, please, I don't want that to happen. And so for you, recognizing that now, you're like, what steps can I take to start building a life for myself that will minimize the need for that? And so a couple of things that you mentioned, like one, it's kind of built into that because you started this from a place of permaculture, zero waste. Waste is inefficiency. Waste is costing you money. If you can figure out how to have less waste, you're almost by definition making your life less expensive. If we look at it through the lens of age and tying that to health, it's not just how long will I live, but what quality of life will I have in my 60s, 70s, 80s, and beyond. There's many people that are prisoners of their own bodies in their 40s and 50s. And so what if you can delay that as long as possible? But I am curious, like if you want to build on that, what does stacking these forms of capital, how does that practically increase your risk tolerance and, in your mind, reduce your actual risk?
Because, as I mentioned, that since what I really want are these other forms of capital, the financial capital is just the means to access them. If I can find ways to access them that are free or require less spending, it reduces the pressure of accumulating tremendous amounts of capital and helps me get more to what Vicki Robin talks about with that place of enough.
Let me throw one more in here. This is really pertinent. I want to tie this in. So Susie Orman, did I say that name right? I think she was on the Paula Pant show last year. And in a crazy interview that we'll have linked up in the show notes, basically said, if you don't have 10 million to retire, you're crazy. You're crazy. You need 10 million. That's the number. Anybody else, forget about it. You need to work till you're 80. That's all that's out there for you. And one of the things that she cited, the one valid point that I think a lot of us recognize, is that long-term care insurance, which would be an insurance that you would get to take care of you in the case that you needed long-term care, is very expensive. It is a very expensive form of insurance. In your mind, how do these different forms of capital, what does that do for your need to be able to cover the cost of long-term care insurance?
Well, I think certainly if we look at the social capital is key in helping defer those long-term care costs, building up the community around you, especially in your neighborhood where you live, to have people that are checking in on you that can help take care of you. Knowing who the home health workers are that are providing really good service and how to access that, through whatever nonprofits and systems exist in your community. That's going to look different everywhere. And I think looking at health as a form of capital and just maintaining your health as long as possible, maintaining yourself in good health. Now, this is all still unfolding for me. I don't have complete answers to all of this. I'm figuring this out as I go along. And I'm not saying that this is a substitute for elder care for everyone or long-term care insurance.
Yeah, but I'm with you on this, right? This is actually cool. It's like a systems way of thinking. Mm-hmm. It's not just myopically looking at the number and that being the only consideration, right? We're talking about forms of capital, in Jonathan's hypothetical here about long-term care, about aging gracefully, right? Like clearly, like you said, health, unquestionably. If you're focusing on your health from the time you're 30, 40, 50, whatever it may be, there's a higher likelihood that the costs of long-term care are going to be mitigated. You talked just, spiritual, obviously there are religious aspects, but you even mentioned meditation and yoga. If you focus on that as a form of capital, there's a decent to high likelihood that your health is going to be better. It's, talking about social and having close connections. There are so many studies of that being one of the critical components to living a wonderful lifespan, but health span as well, right? Mm-hmm. So it's cool. Again, putting a language to this. I think that to me, you can kind of see me lighting up when I'm talking about this. Like it's cool to have that language and to think about it as a system instead of just as a singular item.
Yes. And I just think there's so much more joy in thinking about it this way. It's focusing on the quality of life instead of just a spreadsheet with a dollar amount on it.
Yeah, and that is the part that I was kind of getting at. Just for the record, I don't agree with Susie on this, and I think it would be very much. Yeah, I realize that it kind of sounded like I'm taking the Susie position.
No, it didn't come across.
I don't think anybody. I don't think you need 10 million if you understand the concepts that we talk about on this show. Like for the record, I'm on the other side of Susie on this one. But what I was trying to get is, I think with the Susie mindset in mind, one could be tricked into thinking it's just a number. You just got to get to the number. Like, that's it. You need to be able to cover long-term care insurance. Like if that's going to cost $10,000 a month, you're going to need that. So you just need to work for another decade. You might need to work till you're 80, and you might not have time to actually spend time building your network, building the other types of capital. But as long as you can save the $10 million, then your last 10 years, you'll have enough to cover the cost of long-term care, of elder care. That is myopic, I think, to reuse that term that we've been using earlier. In fact, to be honest with you, I never thought about this, but it is actually the way internally, without the language I've been using, I call it my talent stack. It's actually encompassing a lot of the various forms of capital. You know, when you think about who you are as a person and the value you have, when I was describing the episode, my investor policy statement, like why I have a risk tolerance, why I'm just 100% in equities and how I came up with that, you know, it's because I was looking at my risk tolerance, and I was looking at my risk tolerance through the lens of my options, and I was looking at my options through the forms of capital that I have. And it wasn't just what my net worth is. It's like, well, because I have a network, because I've cultivated this, because I have a certain number of skill sets, because I have, you know, various forms of capital unlisted to this point, I'm like, I'm going to be fine. And I recognize that it actually changes how I go about with my investing approach. So I wasn't using these terms, but I certainly think that way. And I think a lot of us, there's a power to having a language, there's a power to having terminology, because you can start focusing on building some of these others. And instead of just saying, oh, I'm going to focus on all that stuff once I'm on the other side of 60 and I have more time. No, it actually changes what you need and what you need to plan for if you start building them now. So, you know, although clearly we started the episode talking about it through the lens of investing, and we have different approaches personally to how our strategies for investing, I wholeheartedly and 100% agree with the framework, the philosophy that goes into creating these forms of capital. And Brad, I'm seeing you're nodding your head over there. I suspect you agree with me.
Yeah, no, I definitely do. And Laura, I wanted to ask you about the balance of this, because, you know, you're talking about these forms of capital, these 8 plus at least 3. This is what we want out of life. And I think that to me is the big takeaway from the episode. But maybe it's my old type A personality, but like when I'm looking at these, I'm like, oh no, now it's 11 things I need to keep up with, that like maybe my experiential capital isn't as significant. And I'm kind of joking here, obviously, but like, how do you think about the balance of these? Like when you look at these 11 and you say, I'm out of balance, maybe, or I'm in a deficit, if you will, whatever language you want to use around it on these 2, do you try to build those up, or do you just say this is a system and I can compensate by having social capital? Like maybe I don't know how to build the garden, but because I have that friend who does, it's the overall system. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So it's more along the lines of what you were talking about towards the end of your question. And I'm glad you asked this, because I'm not here to suggest everyone try to strive to be equally rich in all of the forms of capital. I think it's more effective when each of us kind of maybe specialize in some of them, but then we look to our networks, our friends, our family, our community, and let's start asset mapping each other, you know, and recognizing who's rich in what form of capital, and how can we, you know, where can we access these other forms of capital? Because yes, 11 forms of capital now to focus on and try to get rich in all of them is going to be so overwhelming. And I think this is just an opportunity, again, to increase the social capital in our lives by thinking more about what capital already exists. And again, it's not to look at people only as the form of capital they represent in your life. It's just to recognize that they may well represent a form of capital in your life.
You keep dropping knowledge bombs on us, and I love some of these terms, asset mapping. I want to talk about how intentional that is, and if it's a public conversation or a conversation you're having with maybe other people in an accountability group or a mastermind, other people in your network, or is it you just thinking through, oh, here are the people in my network and here's what they're good at. Tell me a little bit more about what asset mapping means to you.
Well, It looks different in different places. Again, when I started talking about how I was introduced to the multiple forms of capital, I mentioned that there are some academics that have been talking about the community capital framework. And so they're going into communities with this community capital framework, which lists forms of capital similar but a little different to what I outlined here. And they're helping communities map their assets. I've seen videos on this on a rural community in Alberta, Canada. And, they were using this to help the community come together and realize that where they were often looked at as a poor rural community, maybe their financial capital wasn't, they weren't rich in financial capital, but they were in other forms of capital. And here in my own community, I have been invited to present several times at a youth farm in a low-income neighborhood in our community. And what I do is I use the multiple forms of capital to show them that they have so many other forms of capital in their community that while they may be considered a financially poor community, they're so rich in so many other forms of capital. And then they will sit down in groups, the youth, and outline what wealth they see in their community.
Walk us through that a little bit more. Like, let's say that someone comes from a community that is, from a financial perspective, it's a poor financial capital community, but you're coming in to try to give them some form of an assessment, or it's just a mindset. You could apply that to your own life, but it's a framework. Like, what did you do to be able to say, oh, look, by the way, and then now to the kids, what does that mean to you now that you know this? Like, give us a sense for what that process was.
Well, I did a good bit of what I've done here by just simply introducing them to all of the forms of capital and explaining them, and then having them, outline for themselves what forms of capital they felt richest in, what they thought as a community they were richest in. And then I gave them some examples. So one of my favorite forms of capital living here in West Central Florida to talk about is mango capital.
Ooh, man.
Because we have so many mango trees here, and so many mangoes are falling in the alleys or on the sidewalks and in the roads or in the yards of older people who can't keep up with them, or people who don't want to keep up with them. So they're there, and we can go collect them and eat them and distribute them to our friends, or, share them with others. Or I've been able to barter them with an organic produce market here in exchange for food or money. So things that are just lying around that we're not tapping. And those neighborhoods where those youth lived that I was talking to have lots of mango trees and things like that. There's just so much abundance around us, so much wealth that isn't recognized as wealth that goes untapped. And when you have that lens of the multiple forms of capital, to start looking at them as forms of capital and recognizing that they're all convertible, if necessary, into financial capital. I mean, we want to harvest each of those forms of capital responsibly. We don't want to deplete them, or get rid of them, eliminate them, but they're there for us.
Yeah, and that sounds like such a hopeful message, right? Mm-hmm. For people who don't realize that they are wealthy in so many of these forms of capital. We focus so much. There's so much attention on financial capital, but that's got to be a really eye-opening exercise for people, right?
Mm-hmm. Very much so.
Laura, we've been blown away. I can tell you our lexicon, our personal language that we use has been changed as a result of this conversation. And words are power. Language is power. It's important. Before we kind of start to wrap up, I just want to ask you, what have we not asked you? Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience that's a big idea or something that kind of changed the way you think through this? It's just, this is open mic night. What else would you want to share with our community?
I just want to make sure, because I am a property owner and a homeowner, and I've talked about it from that angle, but I want to make the point that the multiple forms of capital, I know you have a lot of listeners who live abroad or exploring the nomadic life. These forms of capital are still accessible to people who are traveling a lot or live in apartments and maybe don't have homes. Maybe you're younger and you're not thinking about retirement planning yet, but you can still start exercising this muscle and thinking in terms of the multiple forms of capital at any age and in any place that you find yourself.
And Laura, I agree with that. And I think I'm glad you actually addressed that. I don't want people thinking, oh, well, when I have a home that I have a mortgage on, then I will start building this. But for people that are nomadic, for people that are renting, maybe they're somewhat transient, what practical advice would you offer them to start establishing these forms of capital?
Well, I guess just start recognizing what you already have. I mean, spiritual capital, you can meditate, in many different places. Living capital, if you want to start growing that, but you're nomadic or live in an apartment, you can look for community gardens or, gardens where you can volunteer or farms. The social capital can be developed through the online communities and forums you participate in. So those are a few examples.
Fantastic. All right. People listening to this, I know we just started to introduce the conversation. This isn't a deep dive. This was just, you should probably start thinking about this stuff. And people are. I have a feeling there's a lot of people that are saying, wow, what a missed opportunity if all I focused on was my net worth. And they're going to want to follow up with you. What is the best way for someone to find out more about what you're doing, what your own experience has been with these various forms of capital, and connect with you and your content?
So my blog is richandresilientliving.com. That's probably the best way. You can contact me through the website. I'm also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Pinterest. So you can find me in those places as well.
Laura, thanks so much for coming on the show. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed sharing this with you all.
Brad, how often is it you have a conversation that actually expands your worldview?
Yeah, it's unfortunately rarer than it should be, but that unquestionably was one of them, right? And we talked about this, both you and I said this during the episode. It's when your language is expanded, your mind is expanded, right? And now I think we're both going to think about these different forms of capital just as we go through life. Like I've already left this with, all right, I need to think about where I stand on these 11 different forms that we talked about. I think that is really, really cool. I suspect our audience is going to love this episode.
I'm looking forward to you guys hearing it. I hope you give us and Laura your feedback. Make sure you check out our site. And if you're looking at this through the lens of financial independence and you're saying, you know what, it's time for me to get started on my own path to financial independence, definitely go to choosefi.com/start. We put all of our resources there for you, but make sure you look at it through a holistic lens. What we want, this is not about our net worth. This is about building a better life for ourselves, one small action at a time. And I'm so excited that you're with us on this journey. The fire is spreading, my friends. We'll see you next time as we continue to go down the road less traveled.
You've been listening to Choose FI Radio Podcast, where we help middle-class America build wealth, one life hack at a time.